Hi, Brittany.
Hi, Karen. How are you?
I'm good. I am ready for another episode of the E Word.
Yes. My favorite time of the week.
I know. Hope you had a good week, though.
I did. Although I'm a little bit surprised. What are we going to talk about today?
So, you might have seen Malik Yoba made a statement on social media, and he's basically proposing that he's saying he's no longer a black man. He wants to be referred to as non-white. And I think this concept is super interesting.
Okay. I'm a little bit nervous.
Well, basically, I mean, he's challenging the social construct and essentially kind of putting on blast like the focus of what this administration is talking about, right? So if there's this backlash against Black people or other ethnicities, then really the disparity is between being non-white or white, essentially. And so we should just call it what it is so that it exposes exactly what the intentions are behind many of these different changes, particularly of DEI and other things that are happening very rapidly over the past few weeks. And so I think it sparks an interesting conversation. Like, do we actually need to identify as our different races or ethnicities?
Excellent question. So the part of me that loves being a Black woman and would choose to always come back as a Black woman says, yeah, absolutely, right? I don't want to erase my identity and my unique ethnic and cultural pride. And I also get his point. So initially when you said that, I was very nervous. I'm a little less nervous now. However, getting rid of the pretext is interesting to just lump us all together. So whether you are Chinese American or Black American or wherever, immediately I thought of being from Ecuador or somewhere. But okay, that's my other question. There are many people who have ethnic origins, right? Who may be Latino, for example, and still have different race classifications, right? You can be a white Latino, you can be a Black Latino, you can be an Indigenous American, right? And be Latino, be from a space that speaks Spanish. So what would a white Latino, they would be white.
Well, they are technically classified that way anyway, right? Because typically there are two boxes. So you can be like, right? You just said that, Latino
Right.
and choose to be white, or Latino and choose to be something else. I mean, they have choices, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
But I think it's an interesting conversation because we know race is a social construct. The people who are identified as non-white and Latino and Black, whatever, we didn't create those. Those were created by white people in an effort to other us anyway, to say that we're not white.
Yes.
White has always been the center. And so what if we just rejected the construct that they created? We could actually identify as where we're from or origins or nationality,
Okay.
without identifying as a particular race that they created. Because
So I
they
can just
said
be
we were Black.
American. That's cool.
What'd you say?
I said I could just be American. That's cool.
Exactly. And we know in other countries that construct is different. So in South Africa, and Trevor Noah talks about this quite eloquently, right?
Yes.
There's white, colored, and Black. Black is the lowest class.
Okay.
And through the years, different races have been categorized based on political affiliation. What I can't remember is if, like, for instance, the Japanese and the Chinese, I can't remember which, but through politics, one group was classified as white and the other group was classified as colored. And of course, white had the most privileges, colored
Mm-hmm.
a little less than whites, but definitely more than blacks, and blacks don't have much privileges at all. And so there's this negotiation, okay, of where you sit in the
Right.
class structure, which
Right.
technically has nothing to do with how you look.
Correct. Correct. So this is really interesting. One, because there's a pop artist, Tyla, who also is from South Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and she's received some criticism throughout her career because she refers to herself as colored because that is how she's referred to and perceived in South Africa. And that is very difficult for larger markets, especially in the United States, where racial classifications are different, right? And in US history, being called colored is inappropriate, right? That was an antiquated designation. And so if you look at her, you may say, oh, okay, this is a Black woman. And for her, that doesn't quite
Mm-hmm.
mesh
Mm-hmm.
because she would say, I'm a colored woman. This also reminds me, in law school, I read a case, and our next episode, I'll have to get the details, but I distinctly remember a US court case where people have sued for their whiteness. So there was an Asian immigrant who actually came from Caucasus, right? The Caucasus
Mm-hmm.
Mountains,
Mm-hmm.
and would very well be considered Caucasian.
Right.
And so he did not understand why he was not afforded the same privileges as other Caucasians
Mm-hmm.
slash white people,
Mm-hmm.
right? So white has evolved in the United States. Of course, the Nell Irvin Painter wrote The History of White People.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fantastic book, but white has a different meaning in the United States than it does anywhere else. And it's almost odd to
Yeah.
say that in other spaces. I've been in other spaces, and what we would call white people would say that doesn't make sense. Because in our history, Italian Americans were once not considered white, Irish
Mm-hmm.
Americans were once not considered white, and so on and so forth. Jewish Americans were not considered white. As we're talking about this, it just makes it all seem so ridiculous. I'm just I'm just going round in circles, and it's just like, this is
Because it's all made up
right.
based
It's
on
all made up.
what political influences, what drove the economy. Like, it's not real. And I've never visited Africa, but based on, what I've heard, Africans didn't really consider themselves any color,
Correct.
essentially, right?
Correct.
Until Europeans came and designated them as such.
Right.
So why are we still embracing what the colonizers dubbed us to be?
Mm. Well, I
Why are
think
we holding so tight to it as part of our identity?
huh. Well, maybe because I mean history is told through the lens of the victor,
Mm-hmm.
right? The perceived victor. And to your point, I have visited the continent, and you're absolutely right. And even for my friends, for example, who are Nigerian American, and they've talked about their journey to becoming Black and what it means to be Black within the
Mm-hmm.
United States. Even in being considered Nigerian, there's still so many different ethnic groups within the country of Nigeria. And all of those ethnic groups or tribes, or however you would want to describe it, all come with these prejudices.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So for example, Igbo people are said to be really good with money, and they're perceived to look a particular way. Yoruba
Mhm.
people are perceived to, based on how you present phenotypically. Do you have a high forehead? Do you have a low nose bridge, high nose bridge, the size of your, all of that can typically have people say, oh, okay, I think you're from this particular group. And here's what I believe about this group,
Yeah.
for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
And and this happens everywhere,
Yeah.
right? One of my cousins is Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
And so we spoke about how people in Okinawa have curly hair, right? And not everyone in Japan has this bone straight hair. And so the perception of this curly hair really depends, right? Depends on
Mm-hmm.
where you're from, depends on whether or not it's seen as a good thing or not.
Yep.
Um, humans humans are remarkably consistent. That's what
I
I
know.
will
I
say.
know. I
We are
know.
remarkably consistent no matter where we are on this planet.
Well, the thing is that what I would love for Black people in particular, to talk about the continent, right? Um, to understand their history and like that identification that we had prior to being brought to America is just as important as the identification that we have now in order
Yes.
for us to connect back and know what our regions were called before they were named by the Europeans.
Mm.
And so, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I went and did my African ancestry. So
Okay.
africanancestry.com to understand what tribe I came from.
Okay.
Because that's how we identified ourselves, right? It wasn't
Uh-huh.
necessarily the place. I mean, yes, the place, but that was another, um, identifier. And so it validated on my mother's side that, we're Yoruba people, which was very like empowering for me because when you think of like Africa as a huge continent, it's huge. When you get your ancestry DNA, it tells you about a region, but that region is pretty huge. I can name quite a few regions that my DNA taps into. But to understand that my tribe is Yoruba
Mm-hmm.
wasn't particularly important. And that tribe primarily occupied what today is known as Nigeria. But then there were like I have DNA, a large portion of my DNA is Benin and Togo. And so I was confused because I was thinking in a very European centric way about like, how could I be from these two different areas and this with this one
These
tribe? Like,
rigid borders.
yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't get it. And I was traveling one day and I was, in the Uber or a taxi, I don't know. And it was a Nigerian man and we started talking about this. And he was like, he said something like so incredibly obvious to me. Right? He was just like, well, you know, it wasn't called Benin and Togo and it wasn't called Nigeria, right? Like the Yoruba tribe moved through this particular area, which is now known as these areas. And then the Europeans, erected these borders, but it didn't mean that the people didn't move across and move between them. They operated the same way they always operated. It's just that there's these created boundaries.
Right.
By the
Trade,
Europeans.
commerce,
Exactly.
marriage, etc.
Exactly. So he basically just educated me on, how people, moved about, particularly the Yoruba tribe. And, I'm also part Fulani and I didn't understand that part too, because that was like on my father's side. And he was like, well, tribes weren't always warring, right? They intermingled all the
Correct.
time, right?
Right.
And the Fulani really occupied northern Nigeria, and the Yoruba primarily occupied southern Nigeria into now is what is known Benin and Togo. And so there's a lot of trade and intermingling and all that type of stuff. So this is why you could have this nice mixture. And it just provided more context to who I was and just inspires me to, dig a little bit further or a lot further to really understand my ancestry, which has nothing to do with being Black, white, or anything of that nature.
Right. And I also want to emphasize, because there are also Black Americans who study Black American culture here and find
Mhm.
that, much like in Benin and Togo and Nigeria, highly regionalized, highly dependent upon where you grew up. So, for
Mhm.
example, uh, Black people, I have family in the Carolinas, North Carolina specifically. And the foods we ate, even now, right? This is informed by hundreds of years of my family being there. And the phrases, cultural practices, aspects of spirituality.
Yes.
To call someone Geechee, right,
Mhm.
is a truncated reference to the Gullah Geechee people, who were people who were enslaved and located within this region and have a very, very specific culture. I want to say maybe it was Sherwin Williams. Someone recently came out with a color that indirectly references this culture that would typically be known as haint blue, because
Mhm.
there's a specific shade of blue that is supposed to be spiritually protected. And so if you go into South Carolina, if you go into these areas, you will very often see porches, either the doors or the ceilings on the porches, or the porches themselves are painted with
Mm.
this very beautiful shade of blue, right? That is very different than Black Americans who maybe settled near the Gulf in Texas,
Mhm.
right? And so there, again, because you have access to the Gulf, you have access closer to Louisiana, you have much more of a French influence and
Mhm.
access to Creole and those types of things. So to your point, it's still happening.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Even in music, right? The way that West Coast hip hop sounds
Mhm.
versus East Coast hip hop, it's so specific. The accents are so specific. And of course, we have planes, trains, and automobiles. People move, people
Mhm.
marry, right? You adopt a little bit from here, sprinkle it over there. But another question I have for you, as you were speaking, when you said, okay, these tribes commingled, intermarried to expand their influence. Said, okay, well, this is why white is created, right? The concept of white within the United States. And back to Malik Yoba's point, the concept of not white is to expand power over and access to resources, right? Because we know that English descended, Puritan descended people, relatively small group.
Right.
So you had to, at a certain point, expand, whether it's to expand your political power, right? Okay, if we want these Irish Americans, we're now going to have to consider them white because they're a sizable voting populace, and
Right.
we can get it. We can get in and maintain power, and so we'll just keep expanding that.
Really cool. Yeah. I mean, they expand also through Latinos, who are a huge part of our population.
Yes.
Who, like we just talked about, many of which probably check the white box, because if you can get away with it, why would you not check the white box if you could check the black box because of how it's perceived? And so that makes it seem, in part, that there are more white people in America. But if we embrace the whole not white versus or white and non-white, that actually makes our block bigger. And in some ways creates a different type of united front.
Very
Because
interesting.
history has shown that creating subgroups actually benefits the majority group, because we can't come together because we want these different privileges. Everybody wants to have more privilege. Nobody wants to give up their privilege. Right. And so when you focus on how do you create that competition and that division, we break off and we fight amongst ourselves, and we don't focus on the real lion in the room, which is potentially whiteness. Right?
Yeah.
So what if we were like, hey, we're all banding together because we're all treated pretty much the same. There's levels of it. And if we got off our high horse and was like, hey, I'll give up some of this privilege to help uplift the other groups. That's a very hard concept for people to actually grasp and do.
For sure.
Let's just dream a little bit. What would that mean? What kind of power would we then wield in society?
I noticed that you made the distinction to separate whiteness versus white people. And I want to uplift that. Can you share your perception of what you think the difference is?
I think I start off, everybody's pretty much, we're humans, right? We bleed the same, we have the same type of capacity, but it's really around the privilege and the opportunity that is upheld by being white, right? So white people actually can be in the same station as Black people when you think of economics and opportunity and capacity. But their whiteness and the way that the world perceives that capacity and opportunity is greater for white people. So whiteness to me is a concept,
right,
built off of how the world works, right? That is applied to white people, but it's not applied equally to all white people, but it's just that leg up over non-white people that white people have, which is called whiteness. I don't know if I have articulated that well.
I think that's perfect, right? Whiteness is better, prettier, gooder, right? Gooder's not a word, but we'll use it for these purposes. Smarter, richer, more able, more competent, more intelligent, more,
More,
whiteness is more,
more.
right, than non-white. And so it is this, to your, this concept that is so seductive, because everyone's in search of grasping toward whiteness. You don't have to be white to try to grasp onto whiteness. And to your point, a lot of people are not fully in possession of this concept of whiteness.
And also don't lean into it as much.
Yes.
I mean, some parts of it, they're automatically given because it just exists for them, just like it just exists for us because of the color of our skin. But some people leverage that to provide themselves more opportunity, and some people don't, whether they don't want to or they don't realize it, that it
Yeah.
exists.
I've had family members who are phenotypically perceived to be white
Mm-hmm.
be able to exist in spaces where whiteness abounds and say, oh my gosh, this is the conversation that's being had. This is the overall perception. And use that whiteness that they're gifted,
Mm-hmm.
to your point, to create safety for others. So there are really large ways where that can happen, and that has happened in the past. So for example, you've had, with the practice of redlining and
Mm-hmm.
preventing people of color, especially Black people, from buying in certain neighborhoods, you will have had white people who would show up to the showings and all of the fundamental parts of the home buying process, and use their whiteness to create opportunity for these people of color, for Black people. So it's a kind of a macro way, or a large way of doing it. You've had like a John Brown, right, who's a very fierce abolitionist, using his station to advocate for people who were enslaved and oppressed. And then you have small, very small ways where that works, where maybe you're in a meeting and you defer to someone with lesser power who has an idea that you support.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of taking the idea for yourself, say, oh, Karen had a really great idea we were speaking about earlier. Karen, do you want to share that?
Exactly. And I think that this has been this concept of whiteness in some ways has been villainized. And I like how you put it, where you said, this is a gift. The universe has given you a gift in this social construct, which is called whiteness. And just how you described, you can use your powers for good. You can use them for really bad. You can use them to be generally self-serving and neutral, or neutral. You can
Right.
use them however you want. The first step is understanding your gift. And then the
Right.
second is deciding how you're going to use it. And the third is like, you might decide to use your gifts sometimes, all the time, or no time. Those are your choices, but you first have to acknowledge that you have it. And it's also not saying that other groups don't have gifts as well. They may not be as powerful as whiteness in certain contexts. Other groups may have more powerful gifts in other contexts. But when you look at the scale, whiteness far surpasses all of those groups. And you have to make an individual decision as to whether or not you believe that it is good for you and society to not use your gifts for good, for example. And that requires, in some cases, nobility, because people do focus on their family first. If you can get the leg up, are you really going to bring somebody with you all the time? And the fact of the matter is you're not.
Yeah.
Right? It is
Right.
survival of the family. And that's why this stuff has been, so pervasive for decades, because people are surviving and they also want to thrive and be better. And they focus on themselves and their families first. That's the
Right.
reality of life. And we're trying to get people to kind of shift their mindset and be more inclusive of bringing people along. And that by bringing people along, it doesn't necessarily harm you. It actually creates abundance for you, your family, and those outer circles.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I saw a clip on social media of a reality TV show, and the clip was maybe 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And there were these two women that were going to start a podcast. One was white, and the other one was Black. I believe she's Black. In any case, they're arguing, and ultimately they decide they're not going to do the podcast together. And so they decide they're going to do their own podcasts. And the Black woman says, good luck trying to get this started without me. And the woman says, I'm white. I'm going to be fine. And the woman was shocked into silence, right? And because I think very often we walk around and we either assume that people are not aware of their privilege,
Mm-hmm.
or not aware of the gifts that they have. And for her to say it so clearly and just so openly was like, I'm going to be like, this is not an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so fascinating. But I also want to take it kind of scope out, because I think white and Black are really easy to juxtapose and to put together and kind of pit against each other. And I think that's always, there's a theory that everything is always reduced to white versus Black.
Correct. Yes, that's true.
And there's the question of what you do when you don't neatly fit into either of those. How do where's your alignment? I have a client who's from Brazil, and she is very frustrated with things like the US Census, or like job applications, which may only allow for one racial identification, because in her experience in Brazil, she experienced a lot of racism. And here she's considered she's considered a Latina. And she feels like that flattens her identity, because she says, do you know that there's so many different, you can be a white Latina, you can be a Black Latina, there are Chino Latinos, there are so many different groups that have melded together within Latin America and have created all of these other groups that don't neatly fit within these squares within the United States. And so she's proud to be an Afro-Latina. And at the same time, she's like, well, if I say Black, then I'm ignoring the fact that I'm Latino. And if I say Latino, I feel like I'm ignoring the fact that I'm Black. I have heard the same from other friends who are white Latinos, and have said, other people looking at me, one of my friends, she said, people refer to me as like a spicy white person, which is like a lot to unpack. And what do you do with that?
I don't know, because these constructs were created at a time when the world was, I guess, not that complex. And as we've intermingled, as people have voluntarily migrated versus involuntarily, right? The world has just changed. And so it's not It's literally no longer black and white.
Yeah.
And you cannot judge people by the color of their skin. You have no idea what is underneath all of that. And we also have mixed up race, ethnicity,
Correct.
nationality. We've
Correct.
commingled all of that, which actually just creates more complexity, which I think makes the argument stronger for white versus non-white, except for the fact that it still centers whiteness.
You are making the exact point I was going to say, which was that I think the world has always been complex in that way, right?
Mhm.
Like there obviously these groups have always existed, and the ability to access one another has to some extent existed. The United States and its particular brand of racism is what's new, and so being inclusive has muddied the waters, right? Being inclusive and allowing for our expansion of identity is what I see exactly why, to your point, a lot of these people do not want inclusion to advance, because then it makes it more difficult to point out the enemy, right?
Mhm.
Or the problem,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Because within one family, you can have white Latinos, you can have black Latinos, you can have indigenous, you know, and the whole family can be concerned with issues like immigration or, you know, whatever it is. The whole family can be part of that.
Hmm.
And their whole experience of the United States can also be very different based on the way that
Hmm.
they look. And our current understanding doesn't allow for the complexity of identity. So to your point, it's just no. Fight.
Maybe we don't need race anymore. Maybe that's not necessary
Huh.
if we want to focus on those pockets of experience and culture that really have meaning, that's really under the iceberg, that we
Mm.
need to understand, because that social construct of race actually, like you said, flattens us in a way that's not representative of truly who we are, at least today. And
Mhm.
so there could be an argument that race needs to just go away. It does then still there's still a gap in how do you now create meaningful buckets, because any bucket you create is not going to be representative of the total experience of any one person.
Right.
But what is it that you really need to know, and not treat people like this massive monolith, but also not go down a rabbit hole where you have so many data points that it just becomes useless and not sustainable. Now, to counter that, we now have new technology called AI, right? That has this vast capacity to unpack all of that. And maybe that's a new use case for it. I don't really know the answer. I know that, a couple of years ago, I did want to work on a project that really reimagined
Mhm.
demographics, because it wasn't inclusive of people and people were feeling left out. And if you look at a person like me, who I guess would be comfortable with the term Afro-Caribbean, and then you look
Mhm.
at your client who's Afro-Latina, those are two different experiences
Right.
that if we got to know intimately those differences, we can really understand those audiences in a much more deeper way. And that's what we need to do in this new society anyway. There's so much noise out there, and you really want to connect. And also, just from a marketing perspective, you really want to connect with your customers, that you really have to do so in a very intimate way in order to cut through that clutter. And how are you going to do that if you just label me as Black?
Right.
versus
And
Afro-Caribbean.
assume that you were right. I mean, I'm just thinking of resource allocation and to your point, marketing. I'm thinking of Appalachia, like it's a very unique, very specific understanding of the world in the United States versus the coastal United States, which the coastal United States, anywhere from, New York to Florida and Washington throughout the state, California, typically the average income is higher, the level of education, the race will vary, but the concerns and the perceived focus may be different than a group in the Midwest or the
Right.
South or Appalachia or anywhere else. And so how yeah, I'm wrestling with, how do you break away race and what else do you use to contextualize the human experience within this country?
Yeah, and I think that's the question that we should start asking ourselves. It's time to rethink how we think about people
Mm,
because we're not the same as 100 years ago. We have evolved in many different ways, in ways that we can't it's hard for the human brain to contextualize. So I think it's a really great opportunity to leverage technology to help us think differently. But we have to be willing to embrace that those differences are good. And it requires just a reimagining of all of our systems too, because they're all based on these boxes.
right.
You know?
These highly antiquated um, versions of self.
Mhm.
And I would say if you want to get your kind of perfect answer, you have to think about how you're asking the question. And I think that's what our challenge is.
Yeah.
I don't think that we're asking the right questions to get the information that we need to make the change that Americans at this point want to see. Whatever side of the aisle they're on, it's very clear that people are dissatisfied
Yeah, that's true. Because you can't,
and want change.
yeah, and need change. Like we need
Yes.
change. It's time. I don't know what that looks like. Maybe the aliens can help us figure it out.
You know, maybe that'll be the thing that unites us all.
I don't know. Because, they're always portrayed as looking very much the same.
Yes.
In some cases, not all, most cases they have huge eyes, but in some cases they don't.
Great.
Vision is very limited, which I've kind of always said, I don't want to be around when this happens because I don't want to be blinded. But if we couldn't see, how would our experience with people differ, right? If you could
Mm,
not look at skin color and judge
right.
based on that, there's obviously voice, which different dialects and things of that nature. We probably figure out how to separate ourselves somehow, some way, because people are very good at that. It's a superpower of
Yes.
theirs. They do
Yes.
not know how to come together.
Yeah. I mean, I just think who's to say that aliens are anthropomorphic? Why do they need two eyes? What if they're just blobs floating through the air? Sentient blobs. What do we do with that?
They could be. That's just not how it's portrayed in the movies. We
No.
don't know.
No.
No
Yeah.
idea. Star Trek did not cover that. Most of the time,
It's
okay,
true.
they were
It looked
anatomically
like that
like
was
how
just different.
cucumber. Exactly.
Exactly. Different colors, but
So maybe we'll see one day. I don't really want to be around for that. But so I don't want it to happen anytime soon. 'Cause I'm not saying it happens tomorrow and I don't
yeah.
want to be around with it. But one day.
Yeah. I'm gonna hope for dogs. Dogs always bring me joy. So if they look like dogs, then I'd be very happy.
That'd be awesome. All right, here we are trying to solve the world's problems, and
Once again,
we're relying on aliens. So, and dogs. And so I think that's a good solution.
Mina thinks it's a great solution too.
Thanks, Mina, and thanks, Malik Yoba, for sparking this conversation. Yes. I'm going
We
one.
appreciate you.
Exactly. All right. Until the next time on the E Word.
Bye.
Bye.